So with The Witch from Mercury starting next month, I've had Gundam on the mind again, which has kind of always been my major fandom hyperfixation. I like a lot of different Gundam media, but the stuff closest to me are the works set in the original timeline, which began in 1979. The original series details a conflict between the Earth Federation, a one-world government that has expanded into space, and the Principality of Zeon, a breakaway state of rogue colonies. In fandom spaces, it's pretty common to see more interest in Zeon, partially I think because of their more Baroque aesthetic and ornate mobile suit designs. I've always been curious though about the way the Federation has been portrayed. They seem less static than comparable factions in genre fiction, like their Star Trek equivalent. And whereas Zeon is fairly consistently an emblem of noble ideals hijacked by fascism, the Federation seems to represent different things in different stories. Sometimes it's a beleaguered, ineffective, but ultimately well-meaning democracy, and in other stories it appears to be its own repressive state, constantly veering into authoritarianism. In this video, I'm going to look at the way 3 different writers have portrayed the Federation. Yoshiyuki Tomino, the original creator of Gundam, Harutoshi Fukui, arguably the leading force for UC Gundam right now, and the writer of Gundam Unicorn, and Yasuo Ohtagaki, whose Gundam Thunderbolt presents a more Gekiga-infused take on the original timeline. I want to make the case in this video for the ways in which the portrayal of the Federation has shifted over time, to function as a metaphor for different social issues and crises. So anyway, let's start with Yoshiyuki Tomino. The original Gundam is actually pretty vague on how the Federation functions as an organization. We get a lot of focus on Zeon's internal politics. We know it's primarily a monarchist dictatorship with a puppet parliament. We see the juicy Shakespearean drama between the Zabi family. But with the Federation, aside from a few brief scenes of its military structure, it's mostly presented as this impersonal mammoth organization, talked about but never fully depicted politically. We know that some of the characters have issues with the Federation, which underscores why rebellions may have developed. Kai Shiden references an Earth elite, suggesting a class imbalance.
Yeah, a native Earth dweller? I knew that rat was one of the elite.
Living on Earth doesn't automatically make you one of the elite. Anyway, Amuro lived with his father on Side 7. He told us he hardly ever gets to Earth and he hasn't seen his mother in ages.
If you live on Earth, you're one of the elite.
And in a scene towards the climax of the narrative, he even jokingly suggests that the main characters should oppose the Federation once they defeat Zeon. But there's also Giran Zabi, the leader of Zeon's line, that the Federation is a weak, shambling, absolute democracy, implying that this is a more traditional post-World War II conflict of democracy versus fascism. My take is that the original series, which is really focused on the white base as this ramshackle family made up of characters who have been set adrift by the war, is more interested in the Federation as a stand-in for an uncaring adult world, impersonal and distanced. But Tomino's depiction of the Federation shifts as his original run goes on. Zeta Gundam inverts the conflict of the original series, the Federation having now empowered an anti-Zeon task force who are veering towards fascism. In Double Zeta, we see the Federation at its most oligarchic. Political officials live opulent lives surrounded by decaying communities, and allow cataclysms under the justification of population control. They're still more of an impassive, corrupt institution than an overtly antagonistic empire, but the tone is definitely shifting towards a more negative depiction. By Char's counterattack, Bright Noah mentions that the Space Noids resent that they are ruled from Earth, suggesting that the Federation's absolute democracy maybe isn't so functional. This all accelerates with Hathaway's Flash and Gaia Gear, both of which feature the Federation's Manhunters as the antagonists, a task force who forcibly deport citizens from Earth.
No one's accept, so let's see it. I lost it. Hurry!
Did they already check your residence permit before you came in here?
Of course they did. Does this happen often?
Yeah, since the Federation forces moved in, things have gotten real bad. Mafty ought to go after them. I wonder why he hasn't yet.
I don't disagree.
The Manhunters as a plot point really cements the Federation as an oligarchy, brutalizing a financial underclass, while wealthy officials enjoy opulent hotels and gated communities. There's a scene in Gundam Hathaway that I think is really interesting for this. Hathaway ducks into a cab to avoid a group of Manhunters.
Awful, aren't they? All the hunters here. This happens all the time. I don't know why Mafty doesn't go after those guys.
He really should get on it. If there's any group that needs their house cleaned, it has to be the Hunters.
Mafty's got too much schooling, if you ask me. He says we should all go into space in the end, right? I just can't wrap my head around his reasons for that. After all, it's not like Davao is really all that polluted, you know?
Maybe, but there's less plant life around, and the fish have gotten more scarce too.
It's enough food for the island. Everyone can still eat.
For now, Mafty's talking about 1,000 years later.
That guy's gotta have a lot of time on his hands. If you gotta work, there's no way you have the luxury to think that far ahead.
Luxury?
Am I right? Especially since you need an Earth residence permit. You gotta pay off some bigwig for one, and you're so focused on getting the money that you can't even think about the day after tomorrow.
Day after tomorrow.
For most of Gundam, we've been following people working within military structures, and most everyone we meet is radicalized in some way. But this is a scene of a regular working person. He's disenfranchised from the Federation, fearful of the Manhunters, but also alienated from the Spacenoid liberation groups, who similarly want a mass exodus from Earth. He's too busy paying off an Earth living permit to really think about the future, but also happy if the Manhunters receive a black eye from liberation groups. In this scene, we seem to have arrived at a very different Federation from the one that emerged in 1979. A neoliberalist, oligarchic institution designed to serve wealthy interests and turn Earth into a playground for the rich.
So tell me then, how does one go about destroying the depths of this mechanism? The human race as a whole can't possibly continue living on Earth.
I see Hirotoshi Fukui as kind of Gundam's arch Federation revisionist. His Federation is overtly a stand-in for US and Western hegemony, rather than being a corrupt, shambling institution whose inequity largely seems to stem from competing interests and bureaucratic indifference. Fukui presents the Federation more as an institution that actively quashes dissent, disrupts local cultures, and is tied to dark conspiracies and internal assassinations. The Gundam Unicorn light novel is even more overt on this Federation equals US angle. The prologue features Cyan Vist, the young terrorist who kickstarts the narrative, being radicalized by the westernization of his home country, English language becoming instituted throughout the nation. It becomes even more overt in the light novel's Earth arc, which was considerably toned down in its OAV adaptation. The antagonist of the Earth arc is Maddie Garvey, a descendant of a wealthy Gulf States Dubai family, radicalized when his wife died in a Federation internment camp. Here, the struggle of the Federation is overtly one of race and religion. Maddie sees the Federation as a white-dominated, atheistic Western institution. This comes to a head in Volume 6 of the novels, in a scene in which he lays out his ideology to the protagonist Ben-Azir. My ancestors knew that it was a matter of time before the oil resources would run out, and set a 100-year plan to build the economy city of Dubai. Once we broke free from the economy that relied on Dubai, Dubai would have given Arabia eternal wealth, but it was ruined by the white men's, Frank's planning, all because they viewed it as a lair for separatists. Those white men always used the same methods. First, they appeased the royalty, who loved to show off, and made them agree to unfavourable investment conditions. Once the economy worsens, they would devour the other part. The terrorist explosion on Laplace, the clearing of the separatists, the collapse of Dubai, everything was part of the Federation scenario. The Garvey family, which is associated with the Abu Dhabi royal family, preserved the resources even the royalty did not know of, Dubai's inheritance, and continued running till now. This is to repay the white men that control the Federation. Now's the time to take action. Maddie Garvey uses his familiar funds in order to construct a massive mobile armor that he uses to enact a surprise assault on the Federation capital of Dakar. It reaches very feverish, very subtlety is for cowards vibes, when the mobile armor tears down a Federation skyscraper, a symbol of Federation commerce. The OAV removes the character of Maddie entirely, replacing him with his daughter Loni, who is retooled to be a more generic Zeon antagonist, but it does retain the post-9/11 imagery of dust clouds weaving through the city.
So it has finally begun then. We must resolve this swiftly.
This is all very on the nose, what I would describe as War on Terror kitsch. The Gundam Unicorn novels came out in 2006, and this fits in with a wave of Iraq War paranoia films around that time. Some amazing satire came from that period, and also a lot of very cringe stuff. By the time the OAV was put in production, this kitsch hysteria had fallen out of fashion, which I think is one of the many reasons why the animation pulls back on a lot of these elements, and totally excises Maddie Garvey as a character. That was almost certainly for the best. Some of this is also rooted in elements from Tomino's original work. In Double Zeta Gundam's Earth arc, we meet the Blue Team, a North African liberation group working with Zeon remnants. The Blue Team describes the Federation as the Frenchmen, a colonizing outside force. The episode is one of the most overt displays of the Federation as oligarchic in the original run. Officials are depicted living in high-tech underground cities, directly beneath the indigenous citizens who live more modest lives. I think these were the elements Fukui was maximizing in his Earth arc. The Federation as an imperialist globalizing force, shaving down indigenous cultures into a one-world government. The elephant in the room in talking about Fukui's Earth Federation is his own politics. It's hard to know exactly where he lies politically now. He seems to have toned down a lot of his statements since becoming, in his words, the J.J. Abrams of Gundam. But before he began writing the Gundam UC novels, Fukui was kind of known as a young right-winger in Japan. Several of his works reframed the Imperial Japanese military as protagonists, fighting for independence against a corrupt US hegemon, and several of these were turned into high-profile Japanese movies. There's even a New York Times article on him based around this. Is this where Fukui's still at? I'm honestly not so sure, but his sympathetic depiction of Zeon, who have always been at least to some extent an Imperial Japanese stand-in, has made this a pretty controversial point. Gundam Thunderbolt's Earth arc offers some parallels to Fukui's, but I'm a bigger fan of the Ohtagaki version. It similarly involves an Earth-based cultural splinter group to the Federation, in this case the South Seas Alliance. The South Seas Alliance also has a religious dimension. They're a Buddhist organization, and there's even a scene where one character says that the Federation prevents them from practicing their religion. So this antagonism towards local religions seems to be a recurring theme in modern depictions of the Federation. If Fukui's Earth arc is an example of War on Terror kitsch, an apocalyptic terrorist organization coming to blows with a conspiratorial US hegemon, then Ohtagaki's Earth arc feels to me more reminiscent of a 70s Vietnam War movie. Aside from the setting, Southeast Asian jungle environments, it's a story in which the characters in the Federation side become disenfranchised with their own ideology, locked in a conflict where their own reasons for fighting become shrouded. In one sequence, a Federation ship hangs over an industrial South Seas Alliance city built from reclaimed oil tankers. It's an image of a cold, impersonal empire hanging over its alienated subjects, who have reclaimed the tools of industry. Moody stuff. This is revisionist Gundam, what I sometimes jokingly refer to as Frank Miller Gundam, but done with purpose. In general too, I'm just a bigger fan of this version of the idea than Fukui's. It's pretty undeniable that the character of Madi Yarvi utilizes a lot of really cringy Orientalist ideas and imagery. Ohtagaki in interviews has talked about his decision to use Buddhism in exploring religion in Gundam, and he said he primarily did that because it's a religion he and a lot of other Japanese people have a familiarity and understanding of. I think this was a really smart choice because it doesn't feel as strained, or to be honest just as cringy as some of that other stuff feels in Gundam Unicorn. Also, just as a side note, I really love the Earth arc of Gundam Thunderbolt. I think it's some of the best Gundam media out there, and I really hope they adapt the rest of it. I don't think it's gonna happen though. Of course, their Federation has also been reinterpreted in basically every alternate timeline as well, sometimes in creative ways, and often not. I'm curious how The Witch from Mercury will portray its equivalent, especially since it seems to be inverting the classic relationship, with the elite now living in space. I think what I find interesting about the Federation is how fluid it can be as a story element. It's very clear, for instance, what Star Trek's Federation embodies. It's a post-war American view of liberal progress, the arc of history bending towards good. Similarly, Star Wars' Empire is a collection of visual signifiers embodying fascism and imperial antagonism. The Federation is harder to sum up than that. It's a corrupt organization, but it's one that houses a lot of contradictions. I enjoy that early Gundam seems to be wrestling with the question of how you unseat hegemonic power, but also the anxiety around trying to imagine a future where that's even achieved. In the 1970s, the Federation seemed to embody an inability for the global order to enact change and respond to crises. In the 1980s and 90s, it became a corrupt oligarchy serving the interests of the rich. And under Fukui's mantle in the 2000s and 2010s, it became a paranoid post-9/11 fever dream. I'm curious to see where it goes in the future.